Horror Tales: The Wine is a first-person survival horror game that was developed and published in 2021 by Carlos Coronado. The game's setting is a pandemic-ravaged fictional Mediterranean archipelago where a mysterious ailment called Devil's Fevers has laid claim to just about every living thing. And if you think this sounds eerily familiar to the shit we've been going through on a global scale for the past 2+ years, well, you'd be right. The dev is even cheeky enough to include a line toward the end of the game about how much of the disastrous effects of the outbreak could have been mitigated by the simplest of actions: wearing a mask. On the nose? You betcha. Did we still need to hear it? Abso-fucking-lutely. The premise of the game is simple. Your family has been impacted by the outbreak and you journey to the Bani de Bosque winery in order to find a bottle of their infamous wine that, if the rumors are to be believed, can cure your loved ones. To succeed at this task, you must solve puzzles that unlock areas in the city and the winery to explore, while avoiding some pretty menacing dudes. And please, don't skim over that last bit. The enemies that pursue you are menacing as hell, and they drop in at very unexpected moments to serve up some really nice jump scares. On top of it all, the musical track that accompanies their giving chase amplifies the tension up to 11. I found myself flipping off the dev not infrequently due to just how excellent the jump scares were. But the enemies don't just serve as fodder for decent jump scares. Often, all while being relentlessly pursued, you will have to solve puzzles that require you to focus on your surroundings, which is a very big ask when, you know, you're being relentlessly pursued. And if you thought this was the worst of what you'd find in the abandoned capital, oh boy! You're also being hunted in a real, most dangerous game fashion. You actually get your first taste of this fella shortly after initially leaving your sailboat. Turns out, there's a gunslinging lad in a plague mask going around shooting full bottles of Bani de Bosque wine just for kicks. And so it might appear to you, especially since you desperately need a preserved bottle for your family. As soon as you peep your first glimmer of hope just beyond your reach, the big bad fires off a shot and shatters the panacea right before your very eyes. Oh well, couldn't make it too easy for us. You'll have to make your way deeper into this seemingly abandoned hellscape in order to find another bottle of wine. So let's talk about what worked really well. For starters, Horror Tales: The Wine is just an absolute pleasure to look at. Way to pick a setting with almost none of the conventional trappings of the horror genre and still make something equally as terrifying. Actually, the stark contrast between the breathtaking beauty of the environment and the horror of feeling completely alone with only the desiccated remains of the island's former occupants to keep you company worked exceedingly well. And the soundscape was the cherry on top to lay the groundwork for an atmosphere of total terror. To add to the terror you experience, reality often shifts in sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle ways. The justification for this comes from one of the symptoms of Devil's Fevers: auditory and visual hallucinations. One minute you'll be walking down a corridor and come up against a dead end. Only, when you turn around, a new route will appear, or you'll crawl your way through a sewage pipe and emerge in a nonsensical, distorted version of reality. This mechanic is executed almost flawlessly, and had such a disorienting effect that I did not feel safe enough to trust my own internal sense of navigation throughout my playthrough. But the crowning achievement for this game would have to be how inclusive it is. The accessibility menu is robust and thoughtfully put together. In fact, you have the ability to tweak over 20 settings to tailor your experience based on preference, as well as any needs you might have. These settings include things like turning enemies and puzzles off, which, if you're like me and have anxiety, the option's pretty nice. Don't get me wrong, I really like to play a game how it was designed to be played, but sometimes my anxiety is just too damn high. Knowing that I could always adjust the setting at any point in my playthrough was comfort enough. And here's when I get a little preachy. This is the direction we need to be moving in for all games. Developers should be thinking about how to make their games accessible to a diverse audience with various needs and preferences, because that's what gamers look like now. We aren't a monolith, and developers who acknowledge and celebrate that fact deserve all the recognition in the world. And now for my least favorite part. What didn't work well for me, or to be more precise, what didn't work quite so well. Probably the most glaring issue had to do with the first-person perspective. Something just wasn't quite right in terms of our character moving about the world. I just wasn't convinced that I was playing from the perspective of a human being with a corporeal frame at parts. Some of the ledges we had to negotiate and tight spaces we had to worm through made me feel more like an apparition than a body of substance. On the flip side, it felt like jumping from any height would cause my kneecaps to shatter. Not the end of the world, and certainly didn't prove too much of an obstacle, but this was all just a little off. Finally, the puzzles were challenging, but there wasn't a lot of variety. It was a lot of looking around for the right symbols to use for the combination doors and physics puzzles involving rail carts and blockades. Again, these proved to be challenging head-scratchers, but I would have appreciated more variety, especially since we have such a rich, complex environment as our setting. All in all, Horror Tales The Wine is a solid indie horror experience with a mildly engaging story set in an absolutely enchanting environment. What it lacks in polish, it certainly makes up for in well-executed jump scares and some truly thrilling moments. The game took me about 3.5 hours to complete, and there is some replay value given the photo mode you unlock after completing the game. I highly recommend giving this one a go if you think your heart can take it.